part 2 of non-stop on Islamic finance. We're going to be talking about Islamic law, right?
Yeah.
And make sure, again, if you have questions, this is going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to this. If you have questions, just go ahead and ask. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning. How is everyone? I'm a bit more nervous in teaching this class, and that's probably because with Islamic law, there is an understanding that when you learn and teach Islamic law, you need to go through like 20 years of training. This is no joke. So because there's this idea that with Islamic law, it's from God, so you have to honor the law. So as a Muslim who studied this, I don't feel sufficiently qualified. So if you put that in your exam, you'll be fine. So that's why there's a bit more nerves here when I talk about Islamic law. That's just out of pure humility more than anything else. But be that as it may, you guys want to learn, so I'm here to teach. And this, what we're going to try and do in this lecture is I'm going to give you a principle. There's going to be about 3 or 4 principles, and then we're going to try and discuss how that's applicable to the modern world. Because one thing you have to understand about Islamic law is that it's based in a very primitive society. They didn't have computers. I'm just stating the obvious here. They didn't have computers. They didn't have transport, which took them from one place to another in the blink of an eye. So understanding of law and how it should be applied was far different back then to what it is now. But at the same time, there's principles from that era that we still use today. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a bad thing. So I'm going to start by looking at the legal framework of an Islamic bank today. Now, a lot of commentators argue that an Islamic bank can only be an Islamic bank if it has a Sharia board. What that means is that there's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 scholars who are going to oversee the processes and the products of an Islamic bank. This gives it validity, because once again, there's an understanding that those scholars understand Islamic law. Now, when Islamic finance boomed in the early 2000s, these scholars were highly in demand. And when I mean highly in demand, the amount of money that these scholars were getting was phenomenal. Because on the one hand, you had Islamic scholars who only understood Islamic law as being as taught from centuries of history, and that was very, what should I say? It wasn't very complex. So when we talked about trade back in the olden times, we're talking about bartering and mainly money concerns. But we weren't talking about banks, we weren't talking about derivatives, we weren't talking about stock markets. So to give you an example of how much these people earned, in the consultancy that I was in, we had to, every 6 months, we had to meet with the Sharia board to look at stocks and shares to see if they agreed with Sharia. 2 meetings per year, 3 scholars. The head scholar earned 30,000 just for 1 meeting, or 2 meetings. I drafted the contract, so I know how much he earned. 30,000 from 1 meeting.
This is pounds?
Dollars. But I don't know if that makes a difference. It's now the thing is, that's just 1 board. He was probably on about 70 boards, and you do the maths. Now that's because there was a real high value for these scholars, and he's a major scholar. And the thing is, he understood commercial law because he did economics in a Western university, and he also understood Islamic law. So he was highly in demand, so they paid him. So if anyone wants to be an Islamic scholar, you won't get that much money now because it's a very saturated market now. In Malaysia, you have educational institutes like INSIEF, which are training Islamic scholars. In the Saudi, you have the same. So more and more Islamic scholars coming who have an understanding of Islamic law and commercial finance. So anyway, the way it works in a bank is that you'll have a product development department. They'll discuss what sort of product we're going to offer. Lawyers, bankers will get together and they'll think, okay, we're going to offer this product. Then there will be it will go back to the Sharia board to say, okay, fine, can we agree with this product? Yeah, can we agree with this product? And what they'll do is that there will be an ex ante audit, i.e., they will check what the Sharia scholars have said and pitch it against the product that has been produced. Once everyone's agreed, then it goes into execution. And then after that, there's an ex post audit, i.e., they'll check whether everything has gone according to Islamic law.
Can you, like, with time, let go of the Sharia board as these things become more and more practiced and known?
There is a potential that maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years longer, that the Sharia board will be obsolete. But at the same time, what does that mean for Islamic finance? Because, like I said at the beginning, an Islamic bank is known because of a Sharia board. But that being said, like in normal banks, you have a legal and compliance department. They're the ones that are meant to look at whether your product agrees with the bank regulations and also the law from the government.
Because here in Qatar, I think what they're trying to do, or even they did recently, they removed all the Sharia boards from all the bank and then did a one unified board with the Qatar Central Bank.
Yeah, that's what it's financially makes more sense. If the Sharia board is like a central bank, like for instance in Malaysia, the central bank there has a very strong Sharia board. So yes, there is this argument that we should go into centralization.
Would the Sharia board, like specific Sharia board, have an influence on the customers of the bank? Would someone invest money because
Possibly.
That person, or?
Yeah, possibly, because sometimes a lot of investors want to see who your Sharia board is.
So basically the Sharia board would represent the bank?
In some senses, yeah. Not only banks, I mean, I'm only focusing on banks, but when you have something like a mutual fund and they see a Sharia board and they see a big name, then investors are going to be like, okay, that is Sharia compliant because he is a big name. He's a brand. And they will invest in that. So if Sheikh Rizwan suddenly thought, okay, I'm going to make this halal, nobody will come to me and nobody will invest in my product. But if Sheikh Baqi Usmani or Nizam Yaqubi says it, then people are going to listen.
So like, for example, there are different sects, and in terms of the details of practices, there might be differences. So for example, the Sharia board, are there like, do you consider there's different sects?
Sects as in...
Like for example, you have the Shia, the Sunnah, they might have different practices in terms of...
Well, with Islamic finance, with the exception of Iran, everything else is Sunni. With the exception of Iran, everything else is Sunni. But even that being said, Iranian banks follow mostly of what Sunni banks do. So it's more or less universal. There might be subtle differences, but it's not too subtle. Now, what I'll explain later on is one of the most important forefathers of modern day Islamic finance was actually a Shia jurist. So, if Shia-Sunni divide can be put together by finance, it's beautiful. Anyone else? No. Okay. Now, I'm going to go a bit more spiritual here. The reason I'm doing that is because with Islamic law, one thing you have to understand is that law is presumed to be coming from God. It's not presumed to be coming from a legislature, i.e. every country is made up of what's called an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary. What that means is that the executive is the one who leads the country, the legislature is the one who issues laws, and the judiciary is the one who interprets the law. Arguably in Islam, all three is in God, except for the judiciary. And so when the judiciary comes, they're meant to be interpreting what they think God and his messenger said. Now that has both a practical element and obviously a spiritual element. These two go together. Now one thing a famous American jurisprudent said that law is basically the issuance of rules to govern behavior. But that's also spirituality as well. It's meant to govern behavior. With Islam, it's meant to be both in one thing. Does that make sense? So this hadith probably encapsulates the the basic belief of Islam. I'm just going to paraphrase. The angel came to the Prophet and asked, what is the Iman? The Prophet said, is to believe in him, the angel, the apostles, etc. You don't need to know too much about that. The next is, what is Islam? God said, it's to worship, it's the 5 pillars. To worship God, to pray, to do Hajj and Ramadan. Then he further asked, what is Ihsan? Perfection. This is to worship God as if you see him, and if you don't see him, then he sees you. So you have to be very scrupulous in your actions. The next bit of the hadith is about eschatology, i.e. what's going to happen at the end of the world. And this is just as a trivia. The 2 things that the Prophet said is when a slave gives birth to a master, don't need to know that, but I want you to think about the second one. When the shepherds of black camels start boasting and competing with others in the construction of tall buildings. I'll let you ponder what that means. But really, religion is based on theology, Iman, the law, Islam, and Ihsan, ethics. And it can be encapsulated when you teach and study Islamic law by this hadith, this quote by a legal scholar, which says, whoever studies tasawwuf, which is about purifying the heart, without observing the law is a heretic. And whoever studies law without tasawwuf is corrupted. And whoever studies spirituality and divine law will find the truth and reality of Islam. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning this is because finance and economics has an effect in the way we behave. And this is an important consideration with Islam. So admittedly, with Islamic finance, that's why when we spoke earlier on Tuesday, we talked about Islam having a social component. Most of you were talking about the profitability element of Islamic finance, but some of you mentioned the social element. The social element goes together with the profitability element. And this is the struggle that Islamic finance has had over the last 40 years. Any questions? Okay. So, do people know the 4 schools of Sunni legal thought? Who does not know? Okay. The fundamental principle of Islamic law is, O you who believe, obey Allah and His Messenger. Now that's fine when the messenger is roaming around with the people. It becomes a bit problematic when the Prophet dies, because now you have no access to a person who can tell you what law is. So what did they do? Essentially what happened is that people began trying to figure out what law would be in novel situations. And they determined a sort of scheme as to how we can decide what law should be. Now, you will have all kinds of novel situations. For instance, banking today is a very novel situation. So you had Islamic scholars trying to determine how could we extract principles from the prophetic period or a positive law and take it to the modern period. Now, what happened around that time when the Islamic Empire expanded is that you have provincial schools, legal schools, that began to who developed their own methodology in how to create law. And the 4 schools that emerged were the main schools, because there were hundreds around that time, but the main schools in Sunni thought, I'm not going to be talking about Shia, but the main schools in Sunni thought were the Malikis, who were based in Medina. And what they believed is because the Prophet lived in Medina, then the practices of the people of Medinan polity would reflect the Prophet. Then you had the Hanafi school, which was based in Kufa, which is in Iraq. Now they came up with the idea of, well, they didn't come up with the idea, but they appropriated the idea of opinion. Like, we don't have to fully go into the Quran and the Hadith. We can think about this situation, and from the principles that we learn, we can apply it. So now, for instance, there's some really bizarre thinking within Islamic legal texts. For instance, there's one fatwa about whether you can marry a mermaid. Now, that might sound really ridiculous, but at the same time, it might have applicability now when we're talking about gender fluidity. There's another fatwa which talks about, can you pray if you're flying on a carpet? You know, you like Aladdin, you know, flying carpets, etc., etc. Once again, sounds very stupid. Has a lot of applicability if you're talking about flying on planes. So Maliki Hanafi, then you have the Shafis. Now, Shafi was a student of Imam Malik. And Shafi is considered to be the first person to come up with a schemata, a methodology as to how we should think about Islamic law and how we should create Islamic law. So what he said is that you need to find the law in the Quran first. That's the first thing that you do. The second thing that you do is the hadith. The third thing, if you can't find it in the Quran and the hadith, then the third thing is that you go with the consensus of the scholars. Ijma, yeah. And the consensus of the scholars is basically because he was around 760, around that time. So you're talking about 100 years of scholarship by that time. And the fourth thing is what's called analogical deduction, which is qiyas, which I'll explain in a little bit of what qiyas means. But that's probably the most important, qiyas. Other legal considerations have to be things like custom, which is known as urf, the public need, like what's happening in society, necessity. Now necessity is important in terms of if you're dying, is it permissible to eat pork? That's where the discussions used to come. And another legal consideration is determining the superior principle, what's called istihsan. Basically, you have two principles in Islamic law, both are halal, but which one do you choose? I suppose an example would be during the time of a famine, Umar bin Khattab noticed, the Khalifa Umar bin Khattab noticed that people were robbing other people for food. Now, according to Islamic law, the principle of theft is that you chop their hands off. But what he did is that he created a moratorium. He said you can't do that because people are dying. And so the principle of need is more important than the positive law according to the Quran. So you can see the interplay of thinking that's going on for society, because law, the thing about Islamic law or any religious law is that you have a problem. You have the problem of absolution, i.e. God says we do. End of story, no thinking, nothing like that. The problem with that is when you have an absolute law, is that people will rebel. Now we noticed that in Western society as well. In the 1920s, America prohibited alcohol. What happened is that people began to drink alcohol but underground. Has anyone heard of Al Capone?
Yeah. Bootleggers.
Pardon?
Bootleggers.
Bootleggers, yeah, exactly. Now gangsterism, the mafia and all that in America really becomes bigger because of prohibition. In 1980, there was the poll tax in the UK, which basically taxed more people an extra bit of their income. There were protests on the streets in the UK. So Parliament has a real problem in balancing the needs of the people and the wants of the people and what they want to achieve. And it's that delicate balance that goes on with legislation all the time. But Islamic law has the problem that God says we obey. That's a huge conflict. Anyway, I want to talk about qiyas. Now, qiyas is what I said was analogical deduction. And the way it works, I'm going to give the theory and then give you an example. The way it works is that you have an original case about which a ruling is given in the text. Then you have the new case, which has similarities to the old case. You want to find what's called the effective cause or the illah between the two. And then you try and transfer the rule governing the original case to the new case. So I'll give you an example. In the Quran it says khamar is prohibited. Khamar meaning grape wine is prohibited. When the Islamic Empire increased, they began to notice people were drinking nabid, which was date wine, which was made of dates. And they also noticed people drinking drinks that were made of barley, i.e. beer. So the scholars had a problem. In the Quran it just talks about khamar. Does it talk about nabid? No. Does it talk about beer? No. But what's the effective cause between those two?
Intoxication.
Intoxication. So they took that rule and put it into the new situation. And that's why we say alcohol is prohibited. But once again, in Islamic law, there is an opinion that nabid, which is basically an alcoholic drink, can be permitted because it doesn't fit, because there's a disagreement as to what the effective cause is. Once again, that can be a topic of controversy between different scholars, because we're trying to think what the effective cause is between an original case and the new case. Does that make sense? Question? So now we come to interest, and soon I'm going to make you guys talk. Interest, I want to divide it into what's called ex post restrictions, i.e. interest charged after the failure to repay, and ex ante restriction, which is interest found at the outset of the transaction. I forgot to mention cardinal laws against interest and excessive uncertainty. Essentially, those are the two foundations of Islamic finance. There is a third, and I'm going to talk about that after I talk about excessive uncertainty. The first one, and the most obvious one, is interest. So you have ex post restrictions and you have ex ante restrictions. That is interest found at the outset of the transaction. And you can find that in spot sales, i.e. I trade with you on spot, or you can find that with credit sales, i.e. I buy now but you give me the good a week later, or you give me the good now and I pay in a week's time. Ex post restrictions is otherwise known as riba al-nasiya, riba al-Quran, riba al-jahaliya. Riba al-nasiya means delay. Riba al-Quran is only found in the Quran, and riba al-jahaliya is because before Islam came, it was thought to be a Jahili community. The Quranic verses are multiple in the Quran regarding riba al-nasiya. The most important is the ones in red. They're part of the bigger verse. So for instance, in one of the verses it says, they argue that trade is like interest. Saying no, trade is not like interest. Now that's very important, because people argued, and they argued in the Christian era as well, that trade and interest are the same thing. Can you understand why it would be the same thing?
Maybe because you're buying something for less than you're selling it for more.
Yep.
There's also kind of like interest being the fee you're charging for the service.
The
Interest being the fee you're charging for the service of lending.
Yep, that could be an interest.
So, I mean, trade involves circulation of wealth, whereas interest means hoarding up of wealth.
Holding up a
Hoarding up wealth.
but arguably yeah.
Like trade and interest, you're selling a convenience. So like in trade, you're selling the convenience of place.
So I can't hear
The
you.
convenience of place, say from like India to Qatar, I'm bringing it to that place.
Yeah.
And interest, you're selling the convenience of time. You need the money today. I don't need it today, so I'm giving it to you. So it's like this kind of convenience is the similar part between them.
But you put the time element in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of them is the time element, the other is the place element.
Okay.
The need element also with the convenience. So you need this product, it might not cost this much, but like I'm selling it for more just because you want it. Okay.
Hold that thought, because that's quite important in the next slide. So the next bit is, you who have believed, do not consume in usury doubled and multiplied. Because what happens with interest, as you know, it could be compounding interest, or it could be, what's the other one? Simple interest. And do you guys have payday lenders here? Do you know what that is? It's basically, in England and America you have it, is that if you really need money now, like 2 days, I go onto the internet and I want a loan of X, like let's say £100, and they put an interest of like something huge, like 10%. And then next day it goes up, and next day it goes up. So by the end of the week you're paying £700. You're meant to pay quicker than that. That's compounded interest. The next thing, The reason why interest is prohibited is because it consumes people's wealth unjustly. Who mentioned that? Somebody mentioned, I forgot to give you. It consumes people's wealth unjustly. Why would it do that? Is because if when I'm giving you a loan, you must be of need. That's the whole point of a loan. And then I'm exploiting you by charging interest. So you're taking his wealth because he's in need. And finally, the one thing I'll mention, but what you give in zakat, desiring the counsel of God, those are multipliers. We have this understanding that interest multiplies our wealth, but according to Islamic law, it's zakat that multiplies our wealth. Now zakat, people know what zakat is? Charity. So zakat is understood to be a purification of wealth, whereas interest is considered a corruption of wealth. These verses do not exclusively relate to loans. It also relates to this idea of when I'm meant to pay, I bought a good and I'm meant to pay at a certain date. But then that date comes and I don't pay. So what happens is that they say, well, you haven't paid me, therefore I'm going to charge you more. And that was considered to be a form of interest. But here's the kicker. Imagine a situation where I said to you, okay, you want to sell me your beanie hat for £50. And I say, well, I don't have £50 today. And you say, well, okay, if you want to buy it, I'll give it to you now. Or I'll give it to you in 2 weeks, but you have to pay me £60. Is that considered interest?
No. Okay, so the way most shops do this in this case is because they might reduce place of inventory or they're losing money, so they're trying to make up for the cost. So
Yeah.
they do that, so that's why I wouldn't consider that interest.
That wouldn't, because you're considering a sort of time value of money. But then isn't that what they do today? When you put issue a loan, they're saying to you, we charge interest because it's meant to be because you've taken our money. This is the opportunity cost. So what's the difference between the two?
Maybe that the second scenario is that it's fixed, so it's like £60 in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
So I know that in 2 weeks I have to pay £10 more.
yeah.
But like the interest, there's a bit of ambiguity in it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know when you're gonna pay, so it might increase if it's in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So I mean that's the difference.
Does that make sense? That's pretty much explains it. Does that make sense? Okay. So that was one way of doing it. The other way was obviously a loan. So it says, they used to say that it is all equal, whether we increase the price in the beginning of sale or we increase it at the time of maturity. Both are equal. It is this objection which has been referred to by the verse that they say that trade or sale is very similar to riba. So that was around the prophetic time. They understood this argument, trade is similar to interest. And you can see even in the modern day, you can see why that issue is a problem, or where the similarity is. Make sense? So I want to ask now, before we talk about this one, when we're talking about this sort of riba, this ex post restriction, I want people to give me examples of where you'll find interest today. Go. Credit cards. What do you mean?
I mean, when you're taking a loan.
I want you to speak.
I had the same two ones, but probably when you're trying to buy a house and the market is
Beautiful.
I just have a question. How do Islamic banks borrow money from the central bank? If they have interest rate.
We'll get to that. But that's another example. Why is that interest? I'm asking you, why is that interest?
Why not?
Yeah, but why is that interest in your head? Just because they call it interest Why is it interest?
Because they give you 50% of the money you deposit.
Yeah.
Then it's in the
It's fixed.
Also, it's
Oh,
not fair.
It's not fair.
No, it's not fixed, but like you get it like I don't know. When I was a kid, like we understood it is like it depends. Like if you're investing in a business, for example, there might be profits or loss, right? But like the bank will always give you interest. So that's why it might be wrong.
But then this is not fair. It's not fair.
It's fixed. No, it's fixed. Like give it like 2%, like whatever. because
So
that's-
what's the problem with that? Because it's always fixed.
Yeah.
So imagine, and they usually give a percent. But imagine I invest in a business now. They say to me, "I'll give you a 2% profit." Is that interest?
That's dividends.
That's what?
I don't think that's dividend, that's getting a share of the profits.
So what's the difference between the two?
Like, what if in
It's like-
case of a loss, then you don't get anything, right?
Huh? In a case of a loss, now you're thinking about loss. What if he's insured?
He's insured as well.
What
Like,
the
I don't make a loss.
when you invest in a company and your share collapses, your share collapses.
So if he loses, I lose, and if he profits, I profit. So I'm a partner with him. But like a bank, if he loses, I squeeze the money out of him, and I'll make sure they have the 2%.
But what if he's insured? The difference is,
That's the way I understand it.
I think when it comes to things like loans and deposit accounts, is you're making the money, the interest out of the money that you're depositing or the money that you're lending. With a business, even if you're taking a percentage of the profit, technically speaking, you're taking a percentage of the profit resulting from the business activities, rather than just that
yeah,
money.
I mean that's it. But the one thing that people didn't say was how you look at a loan, how you look at a deposit. People look at a deposit as a loan. So when you go to a bank, you're actually loaning the bank money. And then on the other hand, what's called financial intermediation is that the bank loans thereafter. And the bank makes a profit because it charges a higher interest at the loan side and a lower interest at the deposit side. But both situations are loans.
What about insurance itself?
Insurance we'll get to because it's somewhat related to interest, but not. I want to put it under the banner of excessive uncertainty. Now, in 2002, the Sheikh Tantawi, I think he was either the Mufti of Al Azhar or the Mufti of Egypt. I can't remember which, but he was both at one point. He issued a fatwa where he essentially said that interest on a deposit account is fine because the deposits were being invested. Similarly, in a deposit in a bank, your money is being invested somewhere else. It might be called a loan, but it's being invested somewhere else. Now, just by semantics, is a deposit a loan or is it an investment? You can have this argument. But Islamic finance is not too concerned. But this debate on interest is still going on today. Like you'll have some people say, well, interest in a bank is perfectly fine. And then you'll have like Islamic finance saying, no, it's not. Because if you say it is fine, what's the point of Islamic finance? So the next type of interest is what is called ex-ante restrictions. I.e., these are restrictions that are on the sale itself, at the time of the sale. Because you could voluntarily go into an interest transaction, or you could be forced to go into an interest transaction. This is a voluntary interest transaction. And you have two scenarios. You have spot transactions, and you have credit transactions. Now, it comes under the name of riba al-fadl. Fadl means excess. Or riba sunnah, because it's only found in the hadith. And the actual hadith itself is prohibited the sale of gold for gold, silver for silver, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, date for date, salt for salt, unless it is in the same quantity for the same quantity, or the thing itself for the thing itself. And that whosoever gives an increase or receives an increase has committed a riba. So, i.e., she has wheat and I have wheat, and she wants 2 bales of wheat for my 1 bale of wheat. Can anyone see the problem with that?
Partnering?
Pardon?
the whole idea of barter is kind of.
Barter's fine though. But
I mean, you're talking about ratios now. What if something has the equivalent value of 2 versus 1?
yeah, but why would I sell? Why would she give me 1 wheat for 2 wheat?
Quality?
Bingo. That's the next hadith.
Why is that a problem?
Pardon?
Why is that a problem?
I have exactly the same yellow jumper that you have, or the same stripe shirt that he has. Exactly the same, but I have 2 of them. Why would I want to purchase 1 of yours for 2 of mine when they're exactly the same?
The difference is quality here.
The quality,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to emphasize, it's the quality. The hadith does not make sense unless you think about quality. And that comes from the second hadith, where basically what happened is that the Prophet, one of his companions, Bilal, went to the Prophet and said, I bought this good quality dates for 2 bad quality dates. And the Prophet said, that is riba. What you should have done is with the bad quality dates, is put them in the market and sold them and got the monetary amount and then bought the good quality dates. Now this is very important because what's happening here, do you guys study economics?
Yeah.
Do you know what marginal utility is?
Yeah.
Do you know what utility is?
Yes.
What is utility? Pardon? Satisfaction. Yes, I was thinking of a song then. Yeah, satisfaction. Exactly. The utility that you get from a good. Now
what if you didn't have any money left after you sold those 2 dates?
then you don't buy the good quality dates.
But then it's the same thing as exchanging. I'm still not clear on that. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, you have those 2 dates, you sell them, and they're sold out, and you get 1 date for that. So it shows that the value is 2 to 1.
That's fine.
But then that's what he did.
No, but he went to the market and monetized it. Instead of giving 2, so imagine if 1 bad quality date equals 2, one good quality date equals 2 bad quality dates. In value, imagine 1 quality date is 5 riyals and 2 bad quality dates 2.5, 2.5.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. But the thing is, what the Prophet wanted to do is that market value, you don't know what the market value is. So what you should be doing is going into the market, and whatever that value is, that's what you should be getting. I.e., when you talk about diminishing marginal utility, etc., economists say that's how you figure out price of goods. That's the theory. Similar here. You're monetizing your good. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have an Adam Smith around the 8th century to figure that one out, but essentially that is utility. You had a question?
Aside from the utility, okay, so 2 points. What if the other party accepted these dates, for example, they like, or for utility, they like it, but it doesn't that allowed?
We'll get to that. That's about freedom of contract and freedom of trade.
And the second point is, for example, rather than looking at it as a bad and good quality, it can be, for example, something that's not scarce and the other one is found a lot and they try to exchange 2 for 1.
Yeah, but it's the same thing.
You need to know the value for it.
It's the same thing. So the first thing you have to think about is, why would anyone do that transaction? Why would I have 2 dates and sell it for 1 of your dates? I've already got that date. Why would I want your 1?
For example, it's from different countries.
Then it's quality.
Okay.
Does that mean, like, if the same date tastes the same, looks the same, exactly the same, would you personally, you're saying I really want some dates from Botswana, would you say, okay, I'm going to sell my 2 Qatari dates for 1 Botswanan date, even though they look the same, taste the same, same juiciness, same pip in the middle, everything? Would you do it? That's pretty much it.
Can you break up the 2 quality dates for 1 date with the same individual into 2 transactions? So we exchange the 2 bad dates for cash, and then in the second transaction we immediately exchange cash for the good date.
Yeah.
That's permissible?
That's permissible.
Okay.
Because the Prophet's saying from that hadith don't do so. But if you want to buy the superior kind of dates, sell the inferior dates for money.
So we're creating a price.
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Do you guys, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions? So, when we looked at those goods, dates, gold, silver, dates, wheat, salt, barley. I don't think barley was in there actually. Yeah, barley. What the scholars had to look at that hadith and say, well, does this apply to all goods? I.e., is it permissible for your yellow jumper and your stripy shirt or your purple hijab and I have all the same? Are these goods, do these count? Can I sell my purple hijab with your purple hijab? Can I sell my yellow jumper for your yellow jumper? And they looked at these goods and they said, what is the effective cause? Remember why I spoke about qiyas? What is the effective cause in this hadith? And the schools came out with 3 different interpretations. The Hanafis thought that all goods that can be weighed and measured, it gets captured under this hadith. So that includes gold and silver. Gold and silver are currency. The Shafis thought it's only for eatables. The Malikis thought it was only limited to the prohibition to non-perishable staple goods that can be stored. So these are important goods that create the sustenance of the economy. Now you guys don't need to worry about barley v barley, but you do have to think about gold and silver. Because what all 3 schools said is that they're a type of currency. You have a question?
Yeah. So let's assume we want to exchange cars. So I have a certain model, you have a certain model. We agree that okay, we're gonna swap cars, and then let's say I add 50,000 more. Would that be fine?
Well, now look at the good itself.
Yeah.
The good is a car. Does that come under? Could you find an effective cause between the goods in that hadith and a car? Is a car like a date? But something like, let me think, grain, some sort of grain would be like wheat or barley. But a car is not like that.
So it's merely commodities and like necessities.
Yeah, necessity good. But the most important thing is gold and silver for present day transaction, because nobody is going to be trading in barley. So now I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to pinpoint the girl right. What example can you give me of a modern day situation where you'd be exchanging goods that are the same?
I think it's wheat because I don't know, I'm from Syria, I'm from Pakistan, so their wheat sells for a lower price than maybe American wheat.
Okay.
So I think that could be one.
That's a good example. What else?
So I know, like, when the mergers and acquisitions, for example, happen, so sometimes the company might issue new shares in replacement for the old ones.
That's one I haven't thought of, but yeah, that's a good example.
So will currency exchanges fall under the limit?
Yeah, currency exchange is probably the biggest one.
Isn't it a bit, like for example, the Qatar Riyal is worth, say $1 today, and tomorrow it's 0.8.
Yeah.
Isn't it demand and supply?
That's demand. But you can see the problem that is arising at this point is that currency would be one. So is it permissible to exchange Qatari riyals for American dollars? If it is, then it should be at exactly the same value. But for instance, what if I want to, like let's say a Qatari riyal is worth $1. Sorry, no, $3 now. So 3 Qatari riyals is worth $1. That would be permissible because the values are the same. But imagine I have an option.
But in 1 month it won't be the same.
It won't be the same. But at this moment in time, when we do, because what did I say? So we're going to come on to that later. But it should be hand to hand at the same time. We'll come on to that in the next one. But currency exchange is an example where this principle can apply.
So for currency exchange to be okay, they need to make it in a form of commission rather than a change in price.
commission for the guy to do his service.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's a different principle because it's a service there. You're actually paying.
But then, like I'm saying, to make it okay, to make it halal, is that what they do?
Yeah, but they're considering it as two different transactions.
Yeah.
Because one is I'm paying you to do a service. Because in the olden times you had money lenders and money exchanges, but they used to pay them a commission.
Like I have like a scenario, for example, like I'm from Egypt, and right now like the dollars, like there's actually like there isn't a lot of dollars in the country. So for example, like one Egyptian pound, like $1 is worth like 7.3 Egyptian pounds at like the bank. But like you can sell it in the black market because like exporters like need dollars, for example, for like 8.5. So I exchange it for 8.5. Would that be like how?
I would think because the market price of that should be 7.5. But then at the same time you could argue the black market is a market. Now notice that's the problem. There is a legal issue here. Like how do you think about these things? It's not black and white.
What about gold?
Gold for jewelry is that people talking you can't, they have to weigh exactly the same. Other scholars argue, well, jewelry is actually a totally different thing to gold. Because jewelry you actually mold it together and create a new product.
If it weighs exactly the same, then it has the same value, right?
Yeah. But once again, the argument, some scholars would argue, well, gold for jewelry is permissible because they're two different goods. But then other scholars will say, well, hold on a second, gold for jewelry made of gold, they're the same thing, so it's not permissible. The dominant opinion is the latter one.
What he asked is like, you know, the hadith where one of the companions went to the Prophet, gave him half a dinar to buy the sheep from the shepherd, bought it for half, and halfway back he found a buyer, he sold it for 1 dinar, so he took the dinar, bought another sheep for the half, and returned back to the Prophet, with the half the dinar and the sheep. So he told him your trade is successful. So this is like demand and supply. So the guy wanted it for 1 dinar and he sold it.
Yeah.
And they want it for like 8.5 or
because the exporting is like.
But this is sheep. You're talking about sheep here. What if I want to sell 1 dinar, I had 1 dirham, for instance. Then the argument changes a little.
Sheep for money and not money for money.
Yeah, and money for money. This is where things become a little murky and blurry. The second thing I was going to mention is ex ante restrictions, which is basically credit transaction. It's about trading gold for gold is riba unless delivery is hand in hand. So you have to do it on the same day. Otherwise, if you do it like 2 weeks later, this is not permissible. So that's where delivery and excess come together. So if I do 1 gold for 2 gold dinars 2 weeks later, that would not be permissible because you have both the excess and the delay. So then you have the currency exchange. Like, would it be permissible to buy dirhams and pay 2 weeks later? The answer will probably be no.
Is it because the value will change in that time?
Values will change, but also because it's the same good. So you have to think about what is the same good and what is not a same good. Now, here's where things become really exciting because all these goods are called ribawi goods. But then imagine an example where, and the example I gave in the lecture notes was sheep for sheep. Sheep is not captured under that ribawi good thing. It is not something that can be weighed, it's not an eatable, or it's not a fungible eatable. What happens then? The Shafis thought it is permissible to trade 1 sheep with 2 sheep to give in 2 weeks later. That's permissible because it doesn't come under this thing called the ribawi good. Does that make sense? They said it was permissible because the good is not captured under that hadith. The Malikis, on the other hand, said that is permissible only if the uses are different. So you talk about a car like a BMW with a BMW which does exactly the same thing would, according to the Malikis, not be permissible. But a BMW for an Xterra would be permissible because the uses are different. The Hanafis, on the other hand, said no. If you've got the same good, then it's not permissible to trade same for same for 2 in 3 weeks' time. Yeah.
Well, all these three different schools of thought are on different boards for Islamic banks. Don't they run into troubles on these?
They have lovely conversations. No, literally they do. They disagree. That's why there's conflict between, say, the Gulf and the Far East. The Gulf are far more conservative. The Far East are far more liberal, and there's conflict between the two. And I'm going to try and get onto that in 11:50. Right. So the principle of riba al-fadl is basically you need to preserve wealth. Now there was someone who spoke about trade. I think it was you. Aren't you impinging on trade? Now, as I've explained, that the Shafis thought if you put an imposition where good for good, then you're imposing upon their freedom of trade. The Maliki said, well, we have to ensure freedom of trade. So it depends on the quality of the good, the use of the good. If the use of the good are different, then it's permissible. Whereas the Hanafi said, no, you can't do that for these same for same. So there is an idea of freedom of trade, freedom of contract. And also the principle behind riba al-fadl is justice and equality. So this is a hadith from Ibn Rushd. Have you heard of Ibn Rushd? No. Read some books. Anyway, no, Ibn Rushd was a famous legal scholar in the 14th century. He's known in Europe as Averroes. He said, as for fungible goods, i.e. wheat, barley, date, etc., measured by volume and weight, equity requires equality. So you can see with the Islamic finance, there has to be justice, there has to be equality. Make sense? Okay. Any questions? The next cardinal law is against excessive uncertainty. And the Quranic verse is, there's two things. There's what's called maysir, which is basically gambling. And what happened in the prophetic time is that you had a game of chance. Like, I don't know, they used to throw stones onto the floor and there was a game that was created. It's like dice. Yeah. So they used to play that during the prophetic time. And the Quranic verse is, O believers, wine and gambling, idols and divination, by arrows are by abominations devised by Satan. Hard. Give me examples of what gambling is today.
Poker.
Soccer.
Poker.
Oh, poker.
Well, soccer too. There's like.
But why would it be? Why would poker be? Would poker be a game of chance if there's no money?
No.
I mean, does it say in anywhere if there's an exchange of something?
That's what they used to bet with these. With what's it called? They used to bet at that time.
So if you're playing with plastic chips, that's okay?
Debatable. Debatable. If you're losing something, that is debatable.
Is it betting on horses or players, for example?
Betting on players?
Like box.
Oh, a boxer. Yeah, that's a game of chance. Irrespective of if Mike Tyson fights you, it's still a game of chance.
Well, if he wins, then I don't lose.
Huh?
If he wins, then I don't lose. You said if there's a loss involved, then it might be gambling. But if he wins, I win. Is that still gambling?
You win what? What do you mean?
I win the money betted on him.
Yeah, but
There's a chance of losing.
There's a probability still there that you lose something, right? So.
And that goes with the stock market too.
Yeah.
How about derivatives and options?
Pardon?
Derivatives and options.
Derivatives and options are a perfect example. Because who's read Big Short? You read Big Short, or are you asking a question?
And
The movie. Now they talked about credit default swaps and that, which is still confusing in my mind, but I'll try and explain it as basically as I can. Credit default swaps, at that time, 2005, this really intelligent person, I think Michael Barry was his name, yeah. What did he do? He said, these loans are going to crumble. There's going to be a default. So I'm going to buy a credit default swap. Essentially, he was betting that the house prices are going to crumble. He was so sure it was untrue. But he was betting. He was betting on the possibility of something occurring. And what did occur? They crumbled. But what else occurred? The whole economy crumbled. So there you have. Now, one thing you have to understand about the modern day economy is that there's two things that have propped it up: interest and speculation. And that's why probably the Islamic world could not develop a financial system naturally, organically, because these two systems have been very successful in terms of creating the system. But there's a third thing that people forget, and this is just an extra point. What Western Europe has done so well is that they've understood how to mobilize savings and deposits and put it into more productive use. That is something that Islamic finance only had like disparate examples of this. They didn't have something that was so unified.
The question is, do you think the economy would be able to run 100% on Islamic finance?
It's never been tried. We have no example, nothing. This is the problem. Everyone says Islamic finance is 1400 years old, but we have no example of a complete Islamic economy. Yes, we can talk about the prophetic type, but more or less every society was working like that.
Because like in Qatar, for example, like Islamic banks, they'd be for like personal use, for personal accounts, but like when you have those large projects and anyone needs to own any company, it's the commercial bank. No one goes for Islamic.
The problem there is Islamic banks don't have a strong deposit base. So when you have Islamic, like Qatar National Bank, 42% of deposits are in Qatar National Bank, 10% are in Islamic Bank, or the Qatar Islamic Bank. It's not enough. Now, if everyone in society put their money into a deposit account in an Islamic bank, then you have differences. Because you could do more because you have more money. Right, so the next one is gharar. Now, Maysir is basically problems when you speculate. Gharar is problems within the good itself. So, for instance, you will have ambiguity. You cannot have ambiguity in a sale. I need to know what I'm buying. So if there's delay in payment of price, there's an ambiguity. If there's delay in transfer of a good, there's ambiguity. If you don't define your product well, there's ambiguity. If I don't know who owns the good, there's ambiguity. And if the quality of the, is that an iPad or is that an IBM computer? There has to be certainty. So gharar can arise in all these situations. Okay?
And about the delay in payment of price and all that, would receivables and payables count as gharar?
Receiving.
Like with accounts receivables and payables, like any company, when they give 30-day terms for suppliers or customers.
Well, this is, now here's the thing about gharar. This list, I put this list not to show that these are all impermissible, because I've already said delay in payment of price is permissible. I put that list down to show that gharar is possible when you delay in payment of price. But if you are certain, if you've contracted everything down and everyone knows what is going on, then it's permissible. With derivatives, the problem is like for an option, for instance, you don't know if price is going to increase or not increase. You bet, you gamble. There's a gharar in that, or there's maysir as well. You don't know. So there has to be certainty. So a scholar gave certain lists, and using this, you guys are gonna be Islamic scholars for the moment, and then you're gonna try and give me a modern day example. So difficulty in putting the buyer in possession of the subject matter, such as the sale of a stray animal or the young still unborn when the mother is not part of the sale. I.e., I sell, I'm a guy, but a camel, is it permissible for me to sell the camel's child whilst it's still in the womb? The answer is no. Any modern day examples? Using the same principle.
Eggs.
Why not? Eggs, if you're selling eggs because you're thinking, the egg is going to give me a really ripe chicken,
Yeah.
then, but if it's for food, then there wouldn't be.
Forward transaction on crude oil,
Yeah, there's gutter in that.
you don't have the crude oil yet.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have that's why short selling, for instance, because when you borrow something and then you sell it, you don't have it, it's not in your possession.
Real estate development projects.
Coming to that. Uncertainty with regard to the price of the subject matter, such as the vendor saying to the buyer, I sell you what is in my sleeve. What that means is, I'll sell you what's behind my back. So you don't know what's...
And that case, what about art?
But people can see art.
What if the artist hasn't made it yet?
Problem. Then either you can look at it, scholars would either look at it, are you buying the good or are you paying him to give you a good? So there's a difference in the way of thinking. Uncertainty with regard to the characteristics of the price of the subject matter, such as the vendor saying to the potential buyer, I sell you a piece of cloth which is in my home, or the sale of article without the buyer inspecting or the seller describing it. I mentioned caveat emptor 2 days ago. You need to look at your goods. You need to know what you're trying to buy. But what potential example is there in modern day?
Amazon.
Amazon. Do you know that good is perfect fine when you buy your book? Do you know?
I have a question. When you request a good from a company, do you know like for a laptop, when they customize your things and you pay for that product but you don't get it delivered? Is it
You don't get.
like you pay for the product to be customized as your preferences,
Yeah.
but you don't get it like at the same. You don't tend to see it. Like, is it
It's the same question as, I think real estate development. I'll explain why that's the same question.
Investment funds?
Huh?
Investment funds?
What's wrong with that?
So if you say, for example, I'll invest in a mall, but like you don't want this, just invest the money now.
The real estate.
That's real estate development.
Yeah.
So I'll get to that.
But for Amazon, it would be permissible because like you can refund or you can easily exchange if you didn't get what you exactly wanted. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
So this would be okay, right?
This would, but if it's like online, somebody says, I'm selling my white shoe, and they don't give me any details about that shoe, but it's just a white shoe.
Yeah.
Would it be permissible to sell? Would it be permissible to buy?
I wouldn't buy it.
But some people might.
Is it haram for both sides or on one side? For example,
Oh, that's a good question. It's because it's stupidity not to check the good. You should check the good, but essentially it would be. I would consider it to be. It can't be prohibited. It's more on the seller side.
so I wouldn't hold any
Sin? I don't know. I'm not God. But yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a very good question. I'm not certain about that. Because there are situations where you are going to get completely screwed by your seller. So it's mostly with the seller. Uncertainty with regard to the quantum of the price or the quantity of the subject matter, such as an offer to sell at today's price at the market price. I mean, that's just blatant, really. It's like an option. It's if I say I'm going to sell that cup of coffee on Tuesday at market price, I don't know what the price is. I mean, yeah, we do, but it's this idea that we don't know the price, we don't know what the subject matter is. I'm going to sell something that she owns, but we don't know what that is. Uncertainty with regard to the date of future performance, such as an offer to sell when a stated person enters the room or when a stated person dies. That's very interesting.
What about life insurance?
Come to that. Everything I'm mentioning here is basically the problems with insurance. Sale of what is not expected to revive, such as the sale of a sick animal. So what I'm trying to say is that subject matter has to be clear, price has to be clear, when you're going to deliver has to be clear. Everything, there has to be certainty in this. The good itself has to be of a certain quality. You have to describe that good perfectly. You have to inspect that good. I've just mentioned all three of these things, so I'm not going to go too much into that.
Sorry. What if you don't really care about the good? It's just something that you don't really care about the quality or anything. Why should you know about these specific things?
Well, if that's the purchase, if you're saying, yeah, I want to buy a bag, I don't care what sort of bag it is, but at the very least, it has to be a bag. So it really depends on what you want. But if you buy a bag and he gives you a horse, you're thinking, no, this doesn't work.
How do you exchange the rights to drill an oil field or something like that? That must be excessive uncertainty.
There's an ambiguity in that. But then at the same time, and this is where we're going to talk about like stocks and shares, is people will say the service itself is a subject matter. So I'm exchanging the rights, I'm actually buying the rights of that good. So maybe we'll look at it as a higher purchase. So they might look at it in a different way. Make sense? Yeah, I'm going to skip that. We'll talk briefly about partnerships because you will hear it. There's three types of partnerships that I'll mention. Mufawada, Inan and Mudaraba. The most important there is Mudaraba because that's what's being used. Now, Mudaraba is that you have a silent investor. He gives an agent money to buy goods in the market and then sell it and make a profit. And then the profit is shared. And the loss goes directly to the investor himself. So the modern day example is what they attempted to do with deposit accounts. What did I mention earlier? I said deposit accounts are loans. But what Islamic banks have tried to do with very little success actually, is that they tried to create what's called a two-tier mudaraba. I.e. the depositors are investors, they invest money into the bank takes that money and then invests it into other services. So you have that same financial intermediation model, but you have it as an investment. One thing that you had in the period of time that I'm thinking about is what's called hiyar. That is legal stratagems. So you have an impermissibility like interest, and then you try and get around it. Now this is a quote about a partnership. I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is the murabaha. The murabaha, and I'll talk about insurance as well, and real estate development. The murabaha is essentially, it's what's called cost plus sale. So you have glasses, you sell it to me, and you say to me, I bought this glass for £50, I'm going to sell it to you for £70. So I know the cost, and I bought the good itself. That's how it used to be practiced. What's happened today is that you have a situation where people will say, like let's say for a house, for example, I want to buy the house, but I don't have the money. I go to a bank, the bank buys the house for 100,000 and sells it to me for 200,000. Why doesn't the bank just give me a loan for 200,000? Why does he have to do that? Because exactly, it's the interest issue. But the thing is, the transaction is more or less the same. They got around this because they said, now in a murabaha, like when she sold me the glasses, I don't have to accept her glasses. I can say, you know what, I don't want to buy it. But what they did in the murabaha is that they took an opinion, a legal opinion from like the 7th, 8th century, and they said that the promise to buy is binding. Whereas in murabaha, I don't have to buy. So you can see, in order to get around this problem of interest, they came out what's called with a legal stratagem, hiyar. They practiced it back in the day, they practice it somewhat today as well. And an interesting quote by a classical scholar is, those who detest the hiyar as a fundamental part of law, in truth detest the foundation of the sharia. Such a view arises from a lack of contemplative effort. So essentially what he's saying is that you need to start thinking about how to get around certain prohibitions.
But in the bank example that you just gave, if the bank is charging the same amount, the excess of amount as same as the amount of the interest, is that permissible for the bank?
If
Profit of the bank is same as the interest amount that it would have been charged to you.
yeah, but you're saying the bank is saying this is not interest, this is part of the sale price. So they will say, we bought it for 100,000, the house, but we'll sell it to you for X amount. Even though that's classed, that would be considered as interest, it's not, it's considered part of the purchase price.
But then this becomes permissible for the customer?
This becomes permissible because it's a trade, it's not a debt lender-borrower relationship.
Like if, for example, in the Islamic model, you divide it and like say pay 20,000 in 10 months. So but if you delay it, it's not going to accumulate more. In the other model, the commercial bank, if you delay it, there would be an interest over that. So you would, like if you say pay it in 1 year and a half instead of 10 months, it might be like 280,000 by that time.
What's the difference between what I'm saying? You're saying because I'm giving a certainty in the price.
Yeah, there is a certainty and like there isn't this interest on the interest itself. It's not accumulated.
Okay, but let's say 100,000 interest of 10%. And in 2 years that would be 110,000 plus another times another 10%, which is 121,000, that's what I have to pay. What if I, as an Islamic bank, say I bought it for 100,000 in 2 years, you pay 121,000?
Yeah, but yeah, so like if we're assuming it's 2 years, if the person takes longer than 2 years.
But typically for any mortgages today, they'll give you a 25-year contract and they'll say you need to pay in 25 years. So there is a certainty. You mentioned real estate and the gutter instance, which I completely forgot to talk about actually. The gutter instance, when you're trying to develop a good, let's say I want to build a house or specifications of a laptop, there is a gutter, but Islamic finance allows that under this idea of what is called istisna, whereby you define what you want and in certain periods you pay a percentage of the price. But because you're defining it, it's permissible. It's one of those exceptions. And even in classical law, you had exceptions. Another example, you might hear this when you talk about sukuk, is salam. Back in the Prophet's time, what used to happen is that you used to have people who, farmers, who the crops hadn't grown. So purchasers would come and say, I will buy these crops, even though they haven't grown, I will buy them for X amount of price, and you will deliver them in 2 months' time when they have grown. Now, I've been stressing that this would be gutter, but the thing is, that was an exception. Once again, everything is defined. There's also a market where the farmer can buy the good from the market and sell it to you. So there are exceptions in Islamic finance. The other one was insurance. Is insurance permissible? According to the rules of Gara, the simple principle, the answer is no. But Islamic finance has got around that. And the way they've done that is what's called, when you have insurance, you pay a premium. Your premium is basically saying, in the event, life insurance, in the event I die, money's going to be given out to me. Instead, what happens is that instead of saying it's a premium, which is a compulsion, Islamic finance says it's a donation. So you donate money and then this accumulates and this gives you an insurance bill.
So, like what Tahawul firms do is basically define a community of contributors and then those contributors support each other in the case of their deaths.
It's essentially mutual insurance. You have different types of insurance. So essentially a mutual insurance scheme. But the premium itself, the issue is, can you pay for something that might or might not happen? The basic principle is no. Like for instance, 10 years ago, I was told car insurance is impermissible. But it's permissible under the idea of darura, because you have you can't drive a car unless you pay insurance. So So the Islamic financial scholar said, but because it's a necessity and you can't get around it, then it's permissible. Now, all these things combined comes because of, it's not because of him, but he's basically the godfather of Islamic finance. Bakr al-Sadr, Shia jurist, very famous, 60s and 70s, unfortunately got executed. But what in the 60s, he wrote books on the Islamic economy. And he spoke about the best situation is that if we have a full Islamic economy. But in the absence of an Islamic economy, what we need to do is replicate conventional financial products for the modern day. So essentially what he's saying, and essentially what is happening with Islamic finance, is that a lot of the products we'll see in Islamic finance that we think are haram, bonds, derivatives even, stock markets maybe because of the gambling aspect, all these things, we need to try and find an Islamic model of that. Same principles, but permitted using these Islamic tools of darura, istihsan, hiyal, qiyas, etc. And that's how industry functions.
Would that be Islamic then?
What is Islamic?
Whatever the law says.
How do you determine what the law is?
Interpretation.
Interpretation. That's all you need to know about Islamic finance. Thank you.
Thank you.